You know, people think that time is a straight line going from point A to point B, but in reality it's more like a big ball of wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. The reason I bring this up is because the Prince of Persia Sands of Time trilogy is exactly like this. Its story can be summed up by thinking of an infinite loop, and the way that it connects back to the first game is very clever. So, sit tight as we conclude our time travel adventure with Prince of Persia, The Two Thrones. Remember how Warrior Within had two different endings? The one where you can kill Kylena, and then the one where you can kill the Dahaka with the water sword and save Kylena? Well, this game does something very smart in case you missed the true ending of Warrior Within. As Kylena narrates in the opening cutscene, she talks about how people think that after the prince journeyed to the Island of Time, he returned home alone. But this is not the truth, and it shows Kylena alive and well on the boat with him. Realizing their mistake, the player can go back to Warrior Within and try to figure out why Kylena is still alive. As Kylena and the prince make their way to Babylon, Kylena talks about how she feels like something has changed in the current timeline and it worries her. The prince promises that no harm will come to her in Babylon, only to find out that the city is under attack. Their boat gets destroyed, Kylena gets kidnapped, and it's up to the prince to rescue her. It's at this point you take control of the prince, and his moveset is exactly the same as in Warrior Within. There are a few additions though. One of my favorites is the speed kill, where the prince sneaks up on enemies and a quicktime event happens. If you hit square at the correct moments, then you instantly kill the enemy. The prince has gotten some new moves outside of combat as well, such as sliding or climbing in a tight space between columns. When he's swinging on a bar, he can prop himself up onto it, and there's these new holes in the wall which the prince can stab his weapon into and use it as a sort of rock climbing pick. There's a few other changes as well. 1. The prince's voice actor is back to Yuri Lowenthal, which I actually prefer. 2. There are still chests, but instead of getting artwork, you get sand credits, which you can use to unlock bonuses in the main menu, such as artwork and cinematics from all three games. Finally, you don't get new time abilities from time portals, you get them from these sand gate thingies, which are protected by special enemies called Guardians. These enemies are special because if you don't kill them quickly, they have the ability to call for backup using the gate, so you'll want to get rid of them first or as soon as possible. As the prince chases after Kylena through Babylon, he begins to wonder what happened. Like, what happened to the soldiers? What happened to his father, the king? Where are all of the civilians? Why is it that when you're driving and looking for an address, you turn down the volume on the radio? Don't worry, all of your questions will be answered soon enough. Except for that radio thing. I don't get why people do that. The prince finds out who's been behind all of this chaos, and what a surprise, it's the vizier, who also has the dagger of time. Shit. The prince tries to stop him, but gets ambushed, and Kylena gets stabbed with the dagger of time, which releases the sands of time again and turns everyone into monsters. The sands fuse with the chain that is wrapped around the prince and burn some glyphs onto his arm. The vizier uses the sands inside the dagger to stab himself and turn into an immortal being. After doing so, he throws the dagger away and the prince grabs it while he falls beneath the crumbling ground and gets the first time power, which is recall, the power to rewind time. This is where the game really begins, and your new objective is to stop the vizier. As you make your way back up to Babylon, the chain around the prince's arm begins to burn, and he transforms into what is known as the Dark Prince. The Dark Prince works a little bit differently than the prince, by the way. 1. He can't wield secondary weapons because he uses the chain as a whip. 2. His health is constantly depleting, and you can die from this, unlike in Warrior Within, where it stopped at a certain point. So be careful. Finally, you can restore your health with sand dropped from enemies instead of drinking water, because touching a pool of water will return the prince back to normal. Another thing that's different between the two princes is how they maneuver. Using the chain, the Dark Prince can grapple onto certain objects while running across a chasm or while running long distances. I think that the Dark Prince is very fun to play as, but having your health deplete constantly is like having a time limit in the back of your head, and that's just cause for anxiety. Even with the prince back to normal, the Dark Prince doesn't really go away. He stays inside the prince's head and has witty commentary, and is trying to convince the prince to let him take over so he can bring the prince over to, well, the dark side. My favorite comments from him are when the prince stands still and the Dark Prince is like, "Hey, let's go, move it or lose it, Buster." I find it quite entertaining, actually. While the prince continues his journey to slay the vizier, eventually you'll come to a section of the game which most people hate, but I thought was actually kind of fun, and that is the chariot part. Essentially, you are moving forward automatically and you cannot slow down or speed up, only turn. The controls during this part are very stiff, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually pretty enjoyable. Oh yeah, enemies are also trying to knock you off or push you into the wall, but you can do the same to them, and it's a wonderful feeling seeing their chariots get destroyed in slow motion, which actually, that reminds me, they added some weird but useful options in this game, such as the option on how frequently slow motion is set. I set mine to always because I don't believe it actually helps, but I get some sort of weird placebo effect where I feel like it helps during the speed kills, like it gives you more time for the button commands. I don't know. What it actually does is make it so that when you finish off an enemy, it shows it in slow motion and makes the prince look all radical. The other options are to turn tutorials or blood on or off, but there's no option for subtitles during cutscenes, which I find weird because the previous two games did have that. Huh. After the chariot escape, the prince gets attacked on a rooftop after a bit of exploring, but the enemy gets shot by an arrow. Wait, the only character I know that uses a bow and arrow was Farah in Sands of Time, and the last time we saw her, the prince gave her back the Dagger of Time. So why is she here? Well, to explain, after the prince did the Grand Rewind in Sands of Time to return everything back to normal, Farah continued on with her life as the daughter of the Maharaja. However, the vizier and the Maharaja went to the Island of Time at some point and returned to India with a scepter, a dagger, and an hourglass. The vizier tells the Maharaja about his plan for immortality and they need to kill the Empress of Time to do it. But the Maharaja basically says, "That's a stupid idea," and the vizier kills him. Farah knows this, which is why she is in Babylon for revenge. Eventually, the two do meet up, and Farah does look somewhat different, which makes sense. This is a different timeline. Also, she doesn't remember the prince at all, which again, different timeline. She wouldn't have any memories of the Grand Rewind. Unlike in Sands of Time where she is constantly by the prince's side and they can harm each other, in this game the prince is trying to constantly catch up to her and meet up. Something always has to separate the two of them though. Of course though, eventually they do meet up and they argue about whether or not to go after the vizier or help out the civilians who are trapped. The argument makes Farah leave and it makes the prince feel bad, but he goes to help the civilians anyway. After rescuing them, the prince goes after Farah to apologize, but before he can reach her, he has to go through a very dark labyrinth of sorts. While down there, he discovers his father's corpse. Well, that's upsetting. The prince decides to take his sword. This sword can kill most enemies with one hit, and it also gives off a dim light to weaken enemies. It also kicks ass. The prince and Farah meet up and she forgives him. Shortly after, a giant army of enemies show up, to which the civilians help out with their own weapons and a battle ensues. The prince and Farah take this opportunity to leave and go after the vizier once and for all. First though, there's a puzzle that needs solving, and yes, there are puzzles spread out throughout the game, and they are fair, not too difficult, not too easy. It would not be a Prince of Persia game without puzzles. There were points where I was stuck, but I never had to look at a guide. Another thing that gets in the way of the prince's path are bosses, which are actually pretty varied and taken out in different ways. The only thing I don't like about them is that they are finished off with the quick time events that are similar to speed kills. And that's all of the bosses. Other than that, the bosses are actually pretty cool. After you complete the puzzle, a bridge opens up and when you try to cross it, the vizier kidnaps Farah. Well, separated again. The prince has to climb up a giant tower which is actually so big that there are 3 save points as you climb up, plus an extra elevator ride to the top where you finally fight the vizier. Now this fight is how you do a boss battle, Ubisoft. The vizier has 3 phases and each phase uses a different skill set of the prince. The first is just a one-on-one duel where you can use all of your moveset and dodges and swords to damage the vizier as much as you can. The second phase has it so that you have to wall run up a pillar to perform a speed kill on each of his wings and then his main body where the prince leaves his father's sword in his chest. The third and final phase mixes platforming and avoiding attacks all to reach the Vizier as fast as possible and then stab him with the Dagger of Time. The Vizier may have thought he was immortal, but his source of immortality was also his weakness. When the prince stabbed him with the dagger, he absorbed all of the sand from the Vizier's body and trapped it in the dagger. A ghostly image of Kylena shows up, and the prince returns the dagger to her, and they fade away into nothing. The prince then goes to pick up the crown, but oh no, the Dark Prince wants it too. This is the true last boss, but I wouldn't even call it a boss, because all you do is chase after the Dark Prince in this weird realm and go through some obstacles that aren't even dangerous. It's actually impossible to die at this moment. After chasing the Dark Prince for a bit, Farah shows up and tells the prince to turn away from him instead and follow her. And when you do, the prince awakens in reality and says the exact same line that he said at the beginning of Sands of Time.
Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong. Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I really am, and why I say this. Come, and I will tell you a tale like none you have ever heard.
I think this is very clever because when Sands of Time started, you're supposed to think that the prince is talking to the player, but in actuality, he was talking to Farah. Actually, wait, maybe he was talking to the player in the first game, because Two Thrones is in a different timeline, so he could just be repeating the line back to her. Like I said at the beginning of the review, time is a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. This concludes the Sands of Time trilogy. I went into this trilogy thinking I was going to love the first one, get frustrated with the second one, and hate the third because that's what I remember feeling as a kid. Turns out, the same thing happened with the Jak and Daxter trilogy. My opinion has changed drastically. I hated the first game, the second one was great, but the third one is actually my favorite. I hope you all have an amazing day, or night, whenever you're watching, and as always, take care.